The winter night pressed against the barracks at Camp Concordia, Kansas, December 1944. Frost covered the wire fences, and inside, a dozen German prisoners huddled around a single object on a wooden table, a dull green can marked U.S. Army Meatballs with gravy. No one had the courage to open it yet. They had mocked it for hours, calling it tin patriotism, sausage. But when Sergeant Dieter Koch finally lifted the lid with a borrowed knife, the can hissed softly, and warm steam rose into the cold air. For a moment, no one spoke. The scent was gentle, familiar, wrong for a war. One soldier whispered, almost apologetically, "American meat, and yet it smells kind." That word, kind, hung in the air like an accusation. None of them had tasted kindness in months. They did not know that this food had been born thousands of miles away, in the heat of a Chicago factory. There, rows of women in white aprons, wives, mothers, daughters, stirred vats of beef and tomato under fluorescent light. Machines pumped, sealed, stamped, and boiled, guided by human hands that believed warmth could travel farther than bullets. Each can carried not just calories but memory. A child's lunch in Ohio, a husband's letter from the Pacific, a mother's prayer in Minnesota. Koch lifted a spoonful. The meatballs glistened, each identical, suspended in thick sauce. He tasted, then closed his eyes. It wasn't luxury. It was order, precision, and something deeper. A discipline that tasted like mercy. In his diary later that night, he wrote, "The Americans feed prisoners with food made by machines. Yet it feels like it was made by people who cared. How can a machine cook like that?" Outside, the camp's generator hummed like a distant heartbeat. Inside, a dozen men chewed in silence, realizing the contradictions steaming before them. A meal mass-produced by metal, yet warmer than any dinner they had known in years. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. The night after their first tasting, the Germans couldn't stop talking about it. The can had crossed an ocean and a war, yet the meat was tender, as if it had been cooked that morning. Corporal Hans Mertens, once a machinist from Bremen, turned the can in his hands and murmured, "How far did you travel?" No one answered, but they soon found out. An American guard, Private Thomas Bell, overheard their curiosity and during morning roll call, pointed to a map pinned on the mess hall wall. "That can," he said, tapping a spot near Chicago, "was filled in Illinois, shipped by rail to New York, loaded on the Liberty ship SS Samuel Chase, and landed at Oran before crossing again here to Kansas with your unit's surrender cargo. 10,000 kilometers, over land, sea, and desert." The distance itself was staggering. But what truly silenced the room was the realization that the taste had survived all of it. The sauce hadn't spoiled, the flavor hadn't faded. Dieter took out his notebook, a small leather-bound diary he'd hidden since capture, and wrote, "Their food marches farther than our soldiers." That evening, as wind howled across the prairie, he and the others sat outside, staring at the railway tracks leading east. They imagined miles of freight cars loaded with cans, crates, flour, engines, and dreams. The same steel lines that had brought them here also carried the proof of America's unreachable reach. The POWs began comparing rations. Their old Wehrmacht tins, gray, greasy, reeking of lard, seemed primitive. One of them struck a spoon on his can and laughed bitterly. "They defeated us with food that doesn't die," he said. Mertens added, "They won not with artillery, but by sending dinner across the world." Private Bell, overhearing again, smiled slightly. "That's logistics," he said. "We don't fight hungry." There was no arrogance in his tone, only fact. America had turned nourishment into strategy. For every German artillery shell, the U.S. shipped 3 cans of food. Each Liberty ship carried over 8,000 tons of provisions, enough to feed an army division for 2 weeks. It wasn't just sustenance, it was stability, the taste of certainty in a collapsing world. That night, Mertens dreamt of home. His mother stirring stew that always ran out before everyone was full. He woke with a strange ache, hunger mixed with awe. The war had taught him that taste could travel farther than ideology. As dawn broke over Kansas, the prisoners stood by the fence, watching an American train rumble past, carrying more boxes stamped with the same words, "Meatballs with gravy." The rations they mocked had crossed the world unspoiled, while nations had burned and borders had fallen. The taste that defied distance wasn't just flavor, it was a message sealed in tin. We can feed the world, and we will not starve. By mid-December, the prisoners had grown curious about how such perfection was possible. Each can, each spoonful, was indistinguishable from the next. No excess, no gap, no variation. Sergeant Dieter Koch couldn't help but compare it to the erratic soups served in his old Wehrmacht unit. Sometimes watery, sometimes burned, always uncertain. One morning, an American maintenance officer invited a few of them to see the camp's small repair workshop. Against the metallic hum of generators, he pointed at a wall chart showing the structure of a typical U.S. food processing line. Conveyors, steam injectors, pressure canners, mechanical ladles synchronized by gears. He explained that in Chicago's Swift & Company or the Hormel plant in Austin, Minnesota, machines didn't merely assist humans, they dictated the rhythm. Every minute, he said, 400 cans roll out, each one identical to the last, not 1 gram off. The Germans listened, spellbound. In their factories before the war, machinery had served human craft. Here, craft served machinery. Later that evening, when the camp cook reheated another batch of American rations, Corporal Hans Mertens split a meatball with his spoon and stared at it. Perfectly round. Same color throughout. "They don't cook with emotion," he muttered. "They cook with pulse. A heartbeat made of steel." Koch nodded slowly. "And yet," he said, "you still taste someone." That remark lingered. Was it possible that machines had learned empathy, or that humans had built machines that preserved it? In his diary that night, Mertens drew a rough sketch of a conveyor belt. Beneath it, he wrote, "Each clang of metal is a prayer for efficiency, each rhythm a hymn of control." He wondered if perhaps the Americans had found beauty not in chaos, but in repetition, in the idea that perfection itself could feed morale. The camp's radio played faint swing music from a Kansas City station. The tempo matched the image in his head, steady, measured, unstoppable. He thought of Germany's factories under bombing raids, where workers toiled in darkness, machines silent between air raid sirens. In contrast, American assembly lines never stopped singing. One of the guards told them a story. At the Hormel plant, workers timed their steps to the beat of conveyor belts, 5 seconds per ladle, 12 per seal. During breaks, they joked that the line had its own heartbeat, stronger than any general's order. The Germans were quiet. They had once believed spirit won wars. Now they saw that rhythm might. That night, while the prairie wind rattled the tin roofs, Koch wrote a single line before sleep. "They have turned regularity into art, and art into victory." The morning mist drifted over Camp Concordia, turning the barbed wire silver. Inside the mess hall, the Germans noticed something new pinned to the wall. A letter written in neat cursive, read aloud by Private Bell. It came from his sister, Mary Bell of Austin, Minnesota, a worker at the Hormel cannery. "Dear Tommy," it began, "we run the lines day and night. The machines never rest, and neither do we. Each shift fills nearly 60,000 cans. Meatballs, stew, chili, all for boys we'll never meet. Sometimes I wonder whose son opens the one I sealed." The room fell still. Bell folded the letter carefully. The POWs had imagined the cans as faceless products born of roaring engines. But now, the food had a name, a handwriting, a heartbeat. Sergeant Koch stared at the paper, tracing the words with his eyes. 60,000 a day, he repeated. He had once supervised 10 workers stamping bolts in Bremen. America's production wasn't just efficient, it was intimate. Their industry was powered by millions of invisible hands that worked not from fear, but from faith. Private Bell pointed toward the north wall, where a calendar hung beside the daily menu. "Every tin you eat is part of that rhythm," he said quietly. "They call it the arsenal of democracy, but my sister says it's more like a kitchen that never sleeps." That night, over dinner, Koch described to the others what he had learned. "The women there," he said, "work until their fingers ache, not to kill, but to feed." Mertens chuckled softly. "Feeding soldiers with the hands of mothers, That's a weapon we never had. In his diary, Koch wrote, "We built our empire on obedience. They built theirs on contribution. We were commanded to give. They volunteered." The Americans had blurred the line between factory and family. The conveyor belts were no longer symbols of cold progress, but of connection. Endless, humming, alive. Later, under the dim barrack lights, one prisoner whispered, "When this is over, I'll tell my wife how they fight wars with kitchens." Through the night, the prairie wind carried the low hum of the camp generator, echoing the pulse of machines thousands of miles away. Somewhere in Minnesota, a woman in a white apron sealed another can and whispered a prayer for a stranger. The Germans didn't know her, but her rhythm had reached them, across oceans, battlefields, and defeat, inside a can of meatballs that smelled like mercy. By January 1945, the barracks of Camp Concordia buzzed with debate. A simple can of food had turned into a philosophical battlefield. Some prisoners mocked the American abundance, insisting it made men soft. "A soldier fed too well forgets hardship," grumbled Corporal Klaus Reinhardt, once a loyal member of the Afrika Korps. "They drown in comfort. That's why they need machines, to do their sweating for them." But others, like Koch and Mertens, had begun to see something deeper. "No," Mertens replied quietly. "Machines here don't replace men. They release them. Their workers don't toil under fear. They trust the rhythm." The argument grew, echoing through Barrack 12. A dozen voices clashed between pride and awakening. One shouted, "They win because they cheat nature." Another retorted, "No, they win because they respect it." To break the tension, Koch retrieved an empty can and placed it on the table. Its metallic surface reflected the weak light of the oil lamp. "This," he said, "was made by women who may never see war, but their work has reached us. Do you not see the power in that?" Silence followed. The air smelled of dust and iron. Private Bell, standing near the door, watched in quiet amusement. Later, he handed Koch a clipping from Life magazine, a photograph of the Hormel plant with hundreds of women working in white caps beneath signs that read, "Every can a promise." Beneath it, in bold letters, the caption, "Feeding the front." Koch studied the picture long into the night. Those faces looked neither oppressed nor triumphant, just steady, focused, determined. He realized Germany had trained its citizens to obey. America had trained its citizens to participate. The next morning, when rations arrived, even Reinhardt ate in silence. He examined the can before opening it, then muttered, "Perhaps strength can come from softness." At the end of that meal, Mertens asked a question no one could answer. If machines can serve humanity so faithfully, what becomes of us when we serve ideology instead? He turned to Bell and asked, "Do you think your sister knows we eat her food?" Bell smiled. "I'll tell her." He never did, but that moment lingered. A bridge between two worlds built from tin, steam, and silence. Audience, what about you? If you were in that barrack, hearing that argument between pride and realization, which side would you have taken? Envy or disbelief? That night, the wind outside carried the faint clang of metal from the workshop. Steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of a distant factory. It was as if the camp itself had joined the debate. And somewhere deep inside every prisoner, an unease grew. If machines could produce kindness, then maybe men had no excuse for cruelty. The first week of February brought a sharp cold. The Kansas plains froze under moonlight, and the camp generator, old and overworked, finally gave out. The lights flickered once, then died. The mess hall went dark. The kitchen stoves went silent. At first, panic rippled through the guards and prisoners alike. Without heat, the camp would turn to ice overnight. But within an hour, trucks arrived from the nearby U.S. Army depot in Salina. Soldiers jumped down with portable field stoves and boxes, hundreds of them, marked U.S. Ration Type C. They worked methodically, unbothered by the wind. Soon, small blue flames flickered across the camp like scattered stars. When the first pot began to boil, the smell rose again. Meatballs and thick brown gravy, the same as before. But this time, the prisoners didn't mock. They just watched. American soldiers ladled the food into tins and handed it directly to them. Corporal Mertens hesitated before taking his portion. The young corporal opposite him, a mechanic from Ohio, smiled and said, "Go on, it's the same stuff we eat." That sentence stopped Mertens cold. The same stuff we eat. Not prisoner food, not leftovers, the same. For the first time, he tasted equality, served on a cold metal spoon. Koch stared into his bowl, steam curling upward. Even their mercy, he whispered, is standardized. It wasn't bitterness, it was awe. Later that night, when power returned, the camp buzzed with talk. Some prisoners couldn't accept it. The idea that their captors would share food during hardship. One muttered, "They feed us like pets." But another corrected him softly, "No, they feed us like men." Private Bell walked through the barracks, handing out more cans. "These came off the same trucks that feed the front," he said. "Don't thank me. Thank the system." That word, system, landed heavier than any sermon. A system that worked even when its lights went out. A nation that fed its enemies not by accident, but by principle. In his diary, Koch wrote, "When their machines stopped, their compassion started." Perhaps that is what victory means. Not conquest, but continuation. He looked at the line of empty cans outside the barracks, glinting under the moon. For a moment, they looked like a trail, stretching eastward, back across the ocean, toward the women who packed them and the machines that hummed without rest. To the audience, can compassion be engineered? Can a system be so well built that kindness becomes automatic? Or does it still need a human pulse behind the piston? Mertens fell asleep that night holding his tin cup. In the distance, the repaired generator roared back to life, its rhythm steady, its warmth spreading again through the camp, a mechanical heart that refused to stop beating. Spring arrived late in 1945. The Kansas fields outside Camp Concordia turned green again, and rumors spread that the war in Europe was nearing its end. Inside the camp, the prisoners moved slower, more thoughtful. They had stopped asking for news from Berlin. Instead, they asked questions about America's factories, schools, and cities, about what life was like for the people who built the things that had quietly defeated them. One afternoon, Sergeant Koch received a letter stamped by the camp censor. It came from Minnesota, from Mary Bell, the sister of Private Bell. She had heard that the prisoners had eaten her meatballs. Her note was short. "Tell them we made each can hoping someone's son, somewhere, would taste home again, even if it wasn't ours." Koch read it aloud. No one spoke. When he finished, he folded it carefully and said, "Perhaps the machines here have more soul than we did." That same week, a Red Cross film team visited the camp to document prisoner welfare. They filmed the kitchen, the garden, the library. When they turned their lens toward the dining hall, a few German soldiers were opening their rations. One paused, staring into the can as if into a mirror. The camera captured that stillness. A face lit by reflection, half in shadow, half in realization. The footage would later be shown in Geneva as proof that humane treatment could reform belief more effectively than punishment. Months later, when the war ended and repatriations began, Koch and Mertens boarded a train east toward New York. They carried one small crate between them. Inside were empty ration tins, polished clean. "Souvenirs," Mertens joked, though his voice trembled. In Hamburg, 1948, he saw the same kind of canning line rebuilt under the Marshall Plan. This time, German workers stood where Americans once had, assembling not for war, but for rebuilding. He recognized the hum, the rhythm, the pulse of machinery that never slept. In his post-war journal, found decades later in a Bremen archive, he wrote, "Machines can cook better than men, but only if men remember why they cook. The secret is not steel, but sympathy sealed inside it." It became a quiet philosophy among former POWs who had seen America, that compassion, once mechanized, could outlive hate. And when Mertens died in 1979, his son found a single relic on his desk, an American can opener, dull with age. A note beneath it read, "The sound of the lid opening. That was the first sound of peace I ever heard." When history remembers victory, it often speaks in the language of battles, of tanks, maps, and flags. But in places like Camp Concordia, victory arrived in silence, steaming from a tin can. It was not the roar of a bomber, but the hiss of heat meeting metal. Not the command of generals, but the patience of women at conveyor belts half a world away. Those prisoners came to America believing that machinery had made men soulless. They left believing that machinery, when guided by mercy, could become an instrument of grace. Every can they opened became less about food and more about revelation. That progress does not erase humanity, it extends it. Long after the war, Sergeant Koch's journals were found by his granddaughter. In one entry, written in faded pencil, he described walking through a rebuilt Hamburg market, seeing canned goods stacked again on wooden crates. He paused before a label marked, "Processed in Minnesota." He didn't buy it. He only smiled, whispering, "I already tasted this country once." History rarely tells stories about food, yet sometimes it's the quiet meals that reveal the deepest truths. That kindness can be industrial, that warmth can travel across oceans, and that mercy can be mass-produced if the heart behind the factory still beats. If you ever open a can today and hear that faint hiss, remember the men who once mistook it for the sound of defeat, and instead found in it the first breath of forgiveness.